Chapter 10, Western musical instruments. We keep using this word about Western and uh, non-Western music, and I think it's time to um, show a map, right? And a world map. Uh, this, when we talk about Western, and we're talking about the derivatives, it's from Europe, okay? That's what we're talking about. So you look at this map here. Any place they speak a European language has history that's European, and their roots are European, okay? Because they're colonized. Russia is has the Ural Mountains right here, and so this part is really Europe. I don't know what Russia's problem is. They have an ego problem or something. But anyway, um, China, in India. India was a colony of Britain, all right, and they do speak English there, right? But they speak other languages as well, a number of languages, but English, I think, is the official language. English in Australia. South Africa was a German colony, and I think they I think they still speak German there, right? I'm not quite sure, but and Algeria was a French colony, and there were some other colonies over here, and this is all European. They speak Spanish, right? And over here, it's European. We speak English. Canada was French and English. Uh, so this is that's what where they speak those European languages. That's what we mean by Western civilization, and the roots of all the music is Western, and it's from Europe. Okay, yeah, a little joke that if you ever seen the movie Blues Brothers, and you should, because there's some great artists in there, and it's a very well made movie, and a lot of just wonderful performances. Um, so Jim Belushi in one scene is in a band, and he goes up to the bar because they're at the wrong place. But he says to the lady behind the bar, he says, "Well, what kind of music do you have here?" And she says, "Oh, we have both kinds. We have country and Western." So when we talk about Western music, that's not what we're talking about. Chapter 10, Western musical instruments, continued. The four families of the Western instruments are strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. Right. So we have aerophones, anything that uses aerophones. So woodwinds and brass are aerophones. Strings are chordophones, and percussion have are membranophones or idiophones. And strings, again, music, sound has to come from some kind of a vibration. And in this case, the string is produced the is the vibrated is vibration to start by bowing or plucking, right? They have that bow that has horsehair on it. Uh, bowed strings include this family of violin, viola, cello, and double bass, right? Small to large, and comparing it to the voice, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. It's a family. And then you have plucked strings only, like the harp and the guitar. And two types of aerophones: woodwind instruments, flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, and saxophone, and brass instruments uh, made of brass, trumpet, French horn, trombone, and tuba. They make them out of fiberglass now. Um, and percussion instruments, the idiophones, the xylophone, right? Uh, Marimba, vibraphone, right? Cymbals, triangle, and then membranophones, the timpani and bass drum. Some are pitched, right, where they actually have a pitch like a timpani, and and others are unpitched, like a tambourine. And then we have the keyboard family with the keyboard, the piano, organ, and synthesizer. They do not fit because the piano is like, well, how is the sound produced? It has strings. So is it a chordophone? But in order to set the strings into motion, you push the key and it has a hammer that's thrown up and strikes the strings. So is it a percussion instrument? I mean, idiophone. Anyway, that's why we have a separate classification called keyboard instruments. Again, this family of small to large and the strings, they all look the same, just bigger and smaller, like brothers and sisters. Special effects regards, it says legato, right? And so if we played, sorry, that would be legato, right? That would be staccato. Pizzicato. The strings are plucked on this violin family. They grab the strings and actually snap it. And sometimes the string will snap on the fingerboard and make a unique sound. So that's what pizzicato. On the guitar, we kind of always do that. That's what we use our fingers to play the guitar. But we will play the string and then put our hand to the side and touch the string. That's what we call pizzicato on the guitar. On the violin, it's when they put the bow aside and they snap the string. Vibrato on the guitar and on the violin is quite different. It's when you are changing the pitch ever so slightly. And on the guitar, it would sound like this. Or on the violin, it would sound the same. But what they do on the violin is they put their finger and then they rock it back and forth like this. And the result is the string length is changing, right? And you roll it one way, it's longer, and you roll it the other way, it's shorter. So that's how they are changing the pitch, because that's what we're doing on vibrato. We're changing the pitch ever slightly up or down. But on the guitar, because we have a fret, by rolling your finger is not going to make any difference because the string is going to length is going to be up to that fret. Where on the violin, they don't have frets. So the rolling of the finger has an effect that we can't get on the guitar. So what we do on the guitar is we actually pull the string and we change the tension. Glissando, when you change notes from one to another note by sliding and connecting the notes. Of course, you can do that on the violin, the glissando. Tremolo on the guitar. We rapidly change strings. On the violin, they use the bow, and they would rapidly change the direction of the bow to make the tremolo sound, rapid notes. A trill is when you change with the left hand 2 notes, alternating. And a double stop on the violin is when you play 2 notes, and on the guitar we do that all the time. We can play 6 notes, right? But because the strings on the guitar are flat, where on the violin family there's an arch, so you cannot play the 1st and the 4th string at the same time. You can roll the bow across, but you can play 2 strings together, and that's called double stops. Mute. There's a little clip that they put over the bridge there and here, and it changes the timbre. It suppresses the vibration of the instrument, and it makes it softer, and it has a different timbre. The harp is one of the oldest instruments, and said this before. The modern art harp that's used in the orchestra has pedals, and it's a diatonic instrument. It's really in only one key at a time, and they change it by pushing this pedal changes the tension on like all of the strings. Like they have like all the A strings, so they're like 7 pedals. I guess I'm not that sure how many pedals there are, but there must be it, right? Because it says there's 8 notes, and then the 8th one is the octave. But they can make them flats or sharps, so they can play, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so when they push the pedal, it changes all the A's. And what they do with that? Well, they could change to A or A sharp, I think, and back and forth. So with that system, they could change it to be D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D, which is a D scale. And of course, the guitar is an old instrument, and a lot of history there. It's a soft instrument compared to the violin family. They are much louder. And the banjo, other, Western instruments, we would call it, but not generally used in the orchestra, but I'm sure they have been. And the banjo is an American instrument invented by slaves. Mandolin is a European instrument. And we say it's related to the guitar, but they're kind of like, well, it's not like the guitar came first and they came after. Well, the banjo did, but that was circumstances. Well, they all circumstances, huh? Anyway, so here is the harp, and so the strings have, some strings are colored, and so that they can keep track of where their hands are and what notes they're playing. So I would think that like all the red ones are a certain note, right? String bass, electric. No, this is an electric bass. And so this is a question that I often ask. Is the bass guitar, is it a guitar or is it a bass? Because the notes are exactly the same. This has generally 4 strings, and this is a modified one that has like 6 strings, it looks like. But anyway, so the question is it a guitar or bass? And we're going to watch this video on the string family, chordophones.
Look at this tiny violin, and this is not the smallest one you can find by any means. String instruments are the only ones that are made in kids' sizes. Unlike the woodwinds, stringed instruments which are old have an astronomical present-day value. An old violin, a Stradivarius for instance, sells for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The irony is, not a single Stradivarius violin has come down to us in completely original condition. With the advent of larger concert halls, instruments had to have a more brilliant sound to be heard. Metal strings replaced gut and were tuned higher and higher, putting more and more pressure on the instrument, so that all the old violins had to be strengthened and fitted by master craftsmen so they wouldn't break under the stress. The varnish on the finest old violins remains something of a mystery today. No one knows what it's made of, or for that matter why an old violin sounds so much better than a new one. Who knows? Perhaps 300 years from now, some violins made today will be considered masterpieces tomorrow. While it could be said that the violin attained the perfect acoustical size and shape 300 years ago, that's not so with the viola. The viola sounds a fifth lower than the violin, but it's only 1/7 larger. If it were the right size, it would be too long for the player's arm. Perhaps basketball players should take up the instrument. As every beginner knows, and every long-suffering next-door neighbor too, stringed instruments are notoriously difficult to play in tune. The exact notes are not marked on the fingerboard, so the player must learn by feel and instinct where to place the fingers. The cello is even larger than the viola, and in its early days was supported between the knees or by a strap over the shoulder. Nowadays it's balanced on the floor by a metal rod called the end pin.
You have light pieces from Bach. Traveling with a cello is the most difficult part of the profession. There's some airlines that put the cello in first class and you sit in cabin class or whatever. And they're just incredible amounts of hassles, even if you do buy a seat for it. I imagine a bass player would have maybe twice the problem, but and so thankfully I'm not involved in playing the double bass, which was my original intention.
The instruments are not as standardized as the violins. For example, some are larger and deeper, and therefore not as brilliant in the upper register. Some are smaller and have a, if you want to call it that, a cello-like or a quality, as opposed to the very deep basso profondo quality of the extreme low registers. Some instruments are better in some registers than others. Also, the shapes are different. Some of them are Gothic in their shoulders. These are the shoulders, and they are cut this way to make life easier for the musician who wants to play up high. Some of them are built like violins, absolutely round, which means you can play up here, but you can't get down into the upper register very easily.
The largest and lowest pitched of the stringed instruments is the double bass. It adds strength and depth to the orchestra. Double basses vary in shape and size more than any other stringed instrument. One enormous giant called the octobass was so huge it needed two people to play it. One to draw the bow across the strings, and the other to make the notes. Well, close, but no cigar. This passage, when you're doing the two down bows, okay, you do tram, diddly bum ba, dee. Now, da da dee. Make sure they're the same length. Tend to come out. The down bows tend to come out longer. All right, you do it again. 1.
We also do other things. We do play a little jazz. We play Latin. And we do things that the violinists simply don't dream about, so we are quite excited about being bass players.
The harp appeared in Persia over 5,000 years ago, but the first probably came shortly after the first twang of the first bow and arrow. The Irish harp of the 9th century is the earliest European instrument, and the harp is still the Irish heraldic symbol today. The harp has a very special effect which gives it a unique sound in the orchestra. It's called the glissando, where the player's fingers sweep up and down the strings.
Woodwind instruments, aerophones, they all use air, right? And so they're not necessarily made of wood, that's for sure. And so how is the sound produced on woodwind instruments? Well, they all use a pipe, and you change the length of the pipe, which then makes it longer or shorter, and that's how you have the pitches arranged or created. And the source of the sound is not the same in all cases, because in a flute, you're just blowing across a hole in a pipe, right? If you ever done it across a empty soft drink bottle, right? If you can get a pitch, and if you blow harder, you get a different pitch. It's an overtone you can get right out of the chamber, the length of the container that you're blowing and across. So that's how the flutes go. And piccolo is an Italian word that just means small. And so we generally say piccolo, meaning that a small flute, but there's an instrument called a piccolo trumpet. And the other woodwinds use a reed, right? That's placed on a mouthpiece, and then you have to put it in your mouth and squeeze it somewhat, but not too hard. And the reed vibrates as you blow air in it. And then, so there are single reed instruments like the clarinet and the saxophone. And then there are double reed instruments where the reed is actually folded over, and it's not, there's no mouthpiece. It's just like two blades of grass, or, and they vibrate as you squeeze it just the right amount and blow the right amount of air. Flute. And again, the flute is a family of instruments, because there's the regular flute, and then there's a piccolo, and then there's an alto flute, and it's a bass flute, and they are just humongous. And here is our oboe players. And it has that distinctive bell shape over here when you look at the oboe and say, oh, what is that? And of course, again, there's no mouthpiece. It's just this fixture that double reeds are attached to, and it's strings around it. And most of oboe players make their own reeds. It's pretty crazy. And the bassoon, another double reed instrument. The very difficult instrument to play, because the fingering was never modernized as they did in other woodwind instruments. And anyway, clarinet. Video on woodwinds and aerophones.
The woodwinds in the orchestra are wind instruments made of wood. The exception is the flute, which today is almost always made of metal, sometimes even of gold. Flutes have been made from clay, wood, ivory, plastic, and even glass. But metal is preferred because it sounds best, is not influenced by moisture, is readily available, and above all, is easy to machine and solder. In 1846, a man named Böhm invented a fingering mechanism for the flute which revolutionized all the woodwind instruments. His system improved the sound of the flute enormously by making the fingering much easier. Flutes come in all kinds of pitches and sizes, and the highest of them, the piccolo, is the smallest instrument in the orchestra. It's a fairly recent invention and didn't become generally used in the orchestra until about the middle of the 19th century. It always amazes me looking at this instrument. I know so many piccolo players with enormous hands. How can they possibly do it? Double reed instruments like the oboe have been around for a very long time, at least 4,000 years.
The principle of the instrument is really that the pitch is determined by the length of the pipe. So if I cut the end of the straw, the sound will go up.
The sound is produced by blowing on two thin reeds which vibrate together. Have you ever tried to blow a blade of grass between your fingers? Perhaps that's how the oboe was first invented. In skilled hands, the oboe is a gorgeous instrument. It's capable of long, sustained melodies and has become a key member of the orchestra. It's the instrument the orchestra tunes to. But still, it's not without its problems.
I used to demonstrate this wind problem for 6th graders, And I would challenge them to hold their breath with me while I play the opening of the Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony slow movement, that second movement of that. So you can see that the last time I did this, some 11-year-old in the front row just passed out in front of me, and so I haven't challenged sixth graders to do that anymore.
The reeds are made of thin slivers from a wild grass which grows only in the south of France. This cane has to be dried, split, gouged, scraped, folded, tied together and scraped some more to paper thinness, and then it may or may not work. So every oboist must spend hours and hours woodworking before he can even begin to play his instrument. And the same is true for the bassoon, the oboe's big brother.
It's one of the most awkward, if not the most awkward woodwind instrument to play, because there are 33 keys and 5 holes, and the fingerings are normally very awkward, and it's, you know, it's just a big bundle of sticks, as they call it. That's what fregato means.
The bassoon generally forms the lowest part of the woodwind section, but it can play a wide range of notes. Its upper register has a unique and beautiful sound. It's usually machined from pear or maple and is very difficult and expensive to manufacture because the hollow in the wood is U-shaped and doubles back on itself, and because the holes that make the notes have to be finished and tuned by hand.
But sometimes the clarinet player gets an opportunity to shine. The entire orchestra quiets down, the conductor looks at him, and there he is for 8 bars in his glory.
The clarinet is a recent addition to the woodwind family and a direct descendant of the chalumeau, which was a keyless single-reed instrument used in the 17th century. Mozart really put the clarinet on the map with the wonderful concerto which he wrote for his friend Anton Stadler. Unlike the bassoon, the clarinet uses a single reed which lasts a relatively long time and can be purchased commercially. The modern instrument was perfected around 1850 with the help of Böhm's inventions for the flute. Clarinets are made in more different shapes and sizes than any other instrument. Today, most are made from heavy African blackwood, but the less expensive instruments are even plastic.
Brass instruments are made from brass, right? And they're aerophones. They have a cup-shaped mouthpiece where you start, the vibration starts with of buzzing with the lips. And of course, the cup mouthpiece shapes everything, and this all together is called the embouchure, and that's where the sound comes from. So either we have valves, which make tubes longer or shorter, or like on a trombone, there are no valves, but it's just a slide is just by moving it, you're lengthening and shortening the air column. Trumpet, right? French horn is that curled up tubing, and it has more tubing than any instrument. and it's all curled up. It's like 22 feet of tubing, and trombone and the tuba. Trumpets that didn't have valves, right, were very common in the ancient world, right? In the Romans and the Greeks, they used these long instruments that you could play the overtone series only. And actually, this was the way it was done until Bach's time, when they finally added valves, because that was a modern invention. Incidentally, there are two families of there's conical and cylindrical, and so the cylindrical instruments, brass instruments, the tubing doesn't change, it doesn't flare for quite some time. And on the conical, you think it's like a cone. So right or very soon after the mouthpiece, it starts to flare and gets larger gradually to the end of the instrument. The result is a different timbre on the instrument, all right? And the trumpet and trombone are cylindrical instruments, where the French horn and the tuba are conical. And the baritone horn, right, is like a small tuba, and it is also conical. My son, when he was in high school, he played the baritone horn, and I explained to him one time about the difference between cylindrical and conical, and I says, "Yes, son, and your baritone is conical." And he said, "I don't think it's very funny." Trumpet. The tuba and the trombone. A video on brass instruments, aerophones.
Some of the earliest horns from Egypt were made of pure gold. Immediate ancestors of the modern horn were hunting horns. After various changes in shape and size, similar instruments began to appear at the end of the 17th century, but these could only play a few notes. 18th century horns were equipped with tubes to vary the length and pitch of the instrument. The modern horn was born around 1815 with the invention of valves. All brass instruments today are folded or wound or twisted for convenience, so they come in all shapes and sizes. If you uncoiled the horn, it would be over 16 feet long.
On a brass instrument, as you can see, it's all metal. There's nothing to warm up in terms of the instrument. But what you're doing on a brass instrument is you're buzzing your lips.
You all know the sound of the trumpet from jazz, but the earliest trumpets could only play one or two notes. In the 14th century, long brass trumpets were used for military occasions, but these were very inconvenient when on horseback, and so somebody thought of the idea of folding the tubing round and round, which made it more compact and much easier to play on the move.
The unique thing about the trombone is the fact that you have to know where to place the slide to produce the tone. And there's 7 positions on a trombone slide, and none of them are marked. First position is here, second is there, third, and then all the way down to 7th position, which is here. And then if your arm's long enough, you can extend it beyond, and then the slide comes completely off the end of the horn. And that actually happened to me once when I was performing. When I was in high school, I was doing a performance and feverishly moving the slide back and forth. I was so excited about the music, and went all the way off the end, and the slide fell into the second row of the violins.
The trombone was the first of the modern orchestral instruments to appear in its present shape. It was developed by the addition of a slide to a large trumpet, although a similar instrument was found in Pompeii. Today, the trombone is seen in marching bands, and every fall in football fields at half-time, along with its big brother, the tuba, which is the largest and lowest of the brass family. You can't miss its deep, characteristic um-pa-pa as it marches by. The tuba was invented by a Prussian army officer and first constructed in 1835.
Percussion instruments, right? We have pitched and non-pitched percussion instruments. So, and both membranophones and idiophones, because timpani are pitched, right? They have a pedal which changes the tension on the head. And when you see in the orchestra, they sometimes, or many times, they have to, the timpanist has to change the pitch in the middle of the piece. So very quietly, he's touching it and listening and changing the pitch. And he may have a number of timpani, one tunes to F, one to C, one to B flat. And then the composer, he plays the music. Anyway, and then xylophones are also pitched, but they're idiophones. Marimba, right? They're tuned blocks of wood. Now they make them out of some kind of industrial product, I believe. Struck with mallets, right? Vibraphone, metal blocks. Glockenspiel, right? That set of bells. I don't know if they still use those. I don't think they do, but people would have that thing that's shaped like a lyre, and they would have a holster and play that with a mallet. Wow, crazy. Again, march with them. In marching band, we did that. Wow. Officially called Glockenspiel. And in bands and orchestras, we sometimes have these big rack of tubes that are tuned, right? And so a very special sound, timbre. This is interesting that this professional percussionist and is also profoundly deaf. The pianist Yu Yo Wang, actually, it's the same lady that was in the red dress in another video that I showed you. And then we have percussion instruments, membranophones, or idiophones. Well, I don't know about it. Yeah, idiophones that don't have pitch, right? Like snare drum, and they call it snare drum because it has a drum, but it has these wires that are attached to it. You don't see it, and they vibrate, and when you hit it, so it has a different sound, and they can turn that off so it sounds like a boom, or it's more like a splash. These would be tom-tom, tambourine, castanets, triangle, cymbals, gong. These are all idiophones, right? And don't have an exact pitch. Again, we talked about the piano, how it's a kind of, what is it? And the organ, old instruments, right, are actually wind. And you look in a church with those giant pipes and everything, that there has to be air, because it's an aerophone in reality, but it's a keyboard instrument. But they work on air unless it's an electric organ, right? And a harpsichord is a special keyboard that was modified by an inventor to become the piano. The video on percussion instruments.
Perhaps the percussion are the earliest musical instruments. They've been around as long as Homo sapiens, perhaps even longer. It could even be said that our bodies were the first percussion instruments.
So the world is my instrument.
Percussion instruments roughly divide into two groups, depending on whether or not they produce a definite pitch. Percussion without definite pitch, like the bass drum, cymbals, snare drum, castanets, tam-tam, and whip. And those with pitch, like the xylophone and the timpani.
Most of these things, most of the equipment that you see is geographically special. It's indigenous to some area, and it kind of defines that area. And for instance, the New York Philharmonic is going on tour this summer to Asia, and of course that is gong heaven.
The timpani are also called kettle drums. The kettle drums are particularly important in the orchestra because, unlike many other percussion instruments, they can take part in the harmony. A minimum of 3 drums is used in the modern orchestra to avoid constant retuning. Early kettle drums were used to make as much noise as possible to scare the enemy. The earliest were tuned by tightening the animal skins on top of the drums by hand. Later, various mechanisms were invented to make tuning easier. Today, kettle drums are quickly tunable. And now we come to old bones, as it's called, the xylophone. The earliest instruments came from Africa and Indonesia, where they're still played today. The xylophone has a series of resonant bars of wood or synthetic material tuned to an exact scale and arranged much like the keyboard of a piano. One of the first composers to write serious music for the xylophone was Camille Saint-Saëns, more than 100 years ago, when he wrote his Danse Macabre, in which the xylophone is used to depict the rattling of skeleton bones.
And that concludes our chapter 10.